My name is Sophie Paysons from City Imaging Ultrasound for Women, Melbourne, Australia. This is the second in a series of tutorials in which I like to demonstrate how to diagnose deep infiltrating endometriosis with transvaginal ultrasound. The transvaginal ultrasound assessment of the pelvis when looking for deep infiltrating endometriosis should not just include the uterus and the mobility of the uterus, the ovaries and the mobility of the ovaries, but it should also include an assessment of the bladder, the pouch of Douglas, which will be the focus of today's lecture, the vagina, which we will touch on as well in this tutorial, and the bowel, which was the focus of the first tutorial. When looking at the pelvis by laparoscopy, we can see the uterus here and both ovaries, the fallopian tubes, and these are the sacrouterine ligaments. They run between the internal os of the cervix and the pelvic side wall, and they define a space that is called the pouch of Douglas. We see the bowel here. Often endometriosis will first occur on the sacrouterine ligaments, and a nodule will form on these ligaments. From there, endometriosis can then infiltrate into the vaginal wall, causing a vaginal nodule, of which we will see an example later on. The endometriosis can also cause adhesions with the bowel and even infiltrate the bowel wall, causing a bowel nodule. Pouch of Douglas obliteration is defined as adhesions that make it impossible to visualize the pouch of Douglas. And there is a whole range of abnormalities that can be seen, varying from very mild adhesions to these sacrouterine ligaments with still very good mobility of the rest of the uterus, to complete obliteration as we see here on this image. This is the uterus and the ovary, but we cannot recognize any normal anatomy behind the uterus because there are multiple bowel adhesions and adhesions of fat to the posterior uterus, completely obliterating the pouch of Douglas. Now, there is no doubt that treatment of a patient like this is very difficult, and for surgeons, preoperative knowledge of pouch of Douglas obliteration and bowel nodules make a great difference in treatment of the patient. It allows better preoperative planning and therefore better outcomes. When we look at the pouch of Douglas now in sagittal section, we see the bladder, the uterus and the bowel. And the pouch of Douglas actually is a little pouch really that dips behind the vagina. So we can often see this peritoneal reflection when there is fluid in the pouch of Douglas, and we should see sliding between the uterus and the bowel, but also between the cervix and the posterior vaginal wall and the bowel. It is not enough to see sliding here at the top. That is actually very often the case even if there is complete pouch of Douglas obliteration. What we really need to see is a sliding between the posterior vagina and the bowel. So when we look here at this clip, we see the uterus slide very nicely over its entire length against the underlying bowel. And here, this is the peritoneal reflection I'm talking about. So this is actually this area here. The cervix is here. This here is the vaginal wall. And this is the peritoneal reflection in which we see a little bit of free fluid, which makes it much easier to outline the pouch of Douglas. But this is a beautiful example of a non-obliterated pouch of Douglas. Now obviously if we just look in sagittal section, we're not going to see the sacrouterine ligaments, because when we look here, the sacrouterine ligaments are towards the left and towards the right of the midline. So if we want to see the sacrouterine ligaments with ultrasound, we can look in sagittal section, but we need to move towards the left or the right to see it. And that's demonstrated in this clip. So this is the cervix and I'm putting the probe in the posterior fornix. This is a free fluid in the pouch, and this linear structure here, that's a sacrouterine ligament. So sacrouterine ligaments are quite hyperechoic, and therefore on a normal ultrasound where there is no fluid in the pouch of Douglas, they are invisible. But when there is fluid in the pouch of Douglas, then sometimes we can see them. On the other hand, nodules on the sacrouterine ligaments are very hypoechoic, as usually endometriosis is, and therefore hypoechoic nodules in the area of the sacrouterine ligament can be seen even when there is no fluid in the pouch of Douglas, but that is a subject of a later tutorial where we look at more subtle findings in the pouch. The first pathology we look at is complete pouch of Douglas obliteration with very severe adhesions up to the fundus of the uterus. That is something that is easiest to recognize just looking at the position of the uterus. So when the uterus sits in an anteverted position with its cervix, but then the fundus of the uterus is in a fixed retroflexed position, there should be a very high suspicion of complete pouch of Douglas obliteration, because very often it is adhesions behind the uterus that will keep the uterus in this particular position. So when I play this clip, you will see that there is significant adhesions here behind the uterus, between the bowel and the uterus. Here at the fundus there is still a little bit of sliding seen, but this all moves as one block. Most of the time the pouch of Douglas obliteration is not quite this severe. This is the uterus and see nice sliding. Then we see the ovary sort of behind the uterus, and then this cannot be pushed off the cervix. There are adhesions between that echogenic tissue and the bowel and the posterior cervix, but here at the fundus there is good sliding seen between the bowel and the uterus. It is just behind the cervix that we can see the problem. So to actually evaluate the pouch of Douglas in detail, we need again put the probe in the posterior fornix, and I cannot stress that enough because it is almost the key to diagnosis of deep infiltrating endometriosis. When you put the probe in the posterior fornix, it suddenly becomes so easy to see bowel nodules or vaginal nodules or very subtle adhesions in the pouch of Douglas. When we put the probe in the posterior fornix, we see the vagina stretched in front of the probe. And in this clip, I'm just going to evaluate the vaginal wall. So I want to see that the vagina is hypoechoic and thin. And usually when you push the probe, you can feel that it is also quite soft. So this is in the posterior fornix. The vagina is stretched in front of my probe, and I'm going to move the probe from left to right and back. Here, that is all normal vaginal wall. And there we're back anterior to the cervix. But the vaginal wall is always regular, everywhere approximately the same thickness, and you move from left to right in the posterior fornix, just looking at the vaginal wall everywhere. When there is a vaginal nodule, it will be very obvious. They stand out. But if you don't put the probe in the posterior fornix, you will completely miss the vaginal nodule. It is invisible. So you see what I mean when I show you this clip. The probe is in the anterior fornix. You don't notice anything in particular, but putting it in the posterior fornix, you see this really thick nodule in the vaginal wall. So first I'll measure the nodule. And in transverse section, it is quite a large nodule. But then I'm going to go to the left and the right of this nodule. So here, this is the normal vaginal wall, and you'll feel that that feels much softer as well, much less resistance and much less pain. But this is the normal vaginal wall, hypoechoic, thin and regular, and then coming towards the nodule. It will come into view just here. It is very obvious, very big, and then completely to the other side of the nodule the vaginal wall becomes normal again. So it cannot be missed, it stands out incredibly. Sometimes there is a bowel nodule adherent to the vaginal nodule, and then both can be recognized. That was actually the case in the previous clip as well. So if we go back to the previous clip, this is the vaginal nodule. But if you look carefully, after I've measured it, this is the bowel nodule. Very often when you see a big vaginal nodule like that, there will be a bowel nodule stuck to it. And I show you a slightly more subtle clip. So this is the vaginal nodule, and this is the bowel nodule, and this is normal vaginal wall. So when I play the clip, normal vaginal wall, but here thickened vaginal nodule, bowel nodule, and the interface between the two tightly stuck. So on laparoscopy this will just look like one nodule, but with ultrasound we can actually see the interface between where the vaginal nodule is and where the bowel nodule is, and they are tightly stuck together. So the fact that the bowel is stuck to the posterior vagina makes it very likely that the pouch will not be visible, or at least that there will be partial patch of ductless obliteration by these bowel adhesions to the vagina. There are much more subtle findings in the pouch of Douglas as well, such as isolated sacrouterine ligament nodules without associated pouch of Douglas obliteration, or with just very subtle adhesions between the sacrouterine ligament nodule and the bowel without a bowel nodule. It is only when there is a bowel nodule that it becomes easier to identify, because it is the bowel lesion that stands out. And if there is a vaginal nodule, or particularly a vaginal nodule with a bowel nodule adherent to it, then it becomes very easy to see. And it was mainly those findings that I wanted to focus on in this lecture. So complete pouch of Douglas obliteration with adhesions up to the fundus should be recognized because of the unusual position of the uterus, and is then easily demonstrated because no sliding is seen. But more subtle findings in a pouch of Douglas, such as these vaginal nodules or the adhesions between a bowel nodule and a vaginal nodule, are actually also very easy to identify, and they greatly help in the preoperative preparation of the patient with deep infiltrating endometriosis. The more subtle findings will be covered in one of the following lectures.